I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to double check. Can you see the PowerPoint okay?
Yep, it looks great.
And if the chat is up, there's no like kind of box.
That's okay. If somebody puts a question in the chat, I'll be glad to help let you know that somebody's
Okay.
asked a question. Yep.
But if I have the chat up, you can't see it on the screen here, can you?
Nope.
No, okay.
Nope.
Just my own tech stuff. All right. So good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Like Sarah said, please feel free to interject, pop some things into the chat, or we'll have plenty of time after I talk a little bit to just have an open conversation and to hear from you all. I know that some of this might be a review, so apologies, but it's always good to remember. I'm from Sage. My name is Sydney Kopp-Richardson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the National LGBTQ plus Elder Housing Initiative. For those who are maybe not familiar with Sage, we are a nonprofit that has been around based in New York City, but we work nationally, and my work is national. And we work with a wide variety of programs and provide services for LGBTQ plus seniors or elders in New York and nationally. We work with national partners and local community-based organizations across the U.S. We have we build coalitions with policy partners. We work at the local, state, and federal levels to address the challenges that LGBTQ plus elders face as they age, particularly around heightened risks of health complications, financial insecurity, lack of family support, and really a lot of difficulty that we see with people securing safe long-term care and housing, um, and particularly within this political moment, discrimination that people are seeing also at the local state levels as well. This is just a little bit about what we do at Sage. As you can see, policy advocacy. We work with consumers or program participants. We have LGBTQ plus senior centers in each borough of New York City. And there are models of this across the country as well with some of our partners. We have a resource center. So the National Resource Center on LGBTQ plus aging is a repository of research, of resources, of toolkits for people working with elders, for social service providers, for housing providers, for aging care facilities, and for consumers. And this is just a little bit more about what we do, but I can go into that later if people have more specific questions. Um, so we also, as you all know, we know that affordability and safety is a challenge for our communities as we age. So since 2015, the National Housing Initiative, or the NHI, as I'll refer to it, has provided technical assistance and public education around developing safe, affirming, affordable housing for LGBTQ plus elders, serving as a model for best practices and resources for region-specific advocates and service providers and developers across the country. So the 5 key strategies of the NHI are to build housing, to change policy, to educate consumers, to expand services for LGBTQ plus elders, and to provide trainings for community organizations, housing developers, and other stakeholders nationally on LGBTQ plus housing and the needs of elders. Some of the most significant concerns that we see for queer elders is housing for many reasons. So for example, LGBTQ plus elders we know experience discrimination when they're seeking housing. This could be by property management, staff. This could be from other residents or neighbors. It could be from service providers when they're seeking rental housing or senior housing, or home ownership as well. According to an Equal Rights Center report, about 50% of older same-sex couples applying for senior housing were subjected to discrimination, and 50% of single LGBTQ plus elders believe they'll have to work well beyond the retirement age, compared to 27% of single LGBTQ plus peers. We also see that 51% of LGBTQ plus elders are very or extremely concerned about having enough money to live compared to 36% of their non-queer peers. So without affordable LGBTQ plus welcoming or affirming living spaces, it becomes challenging for elders to thrive in their golden years. We've also seen, I'll talk a little bit more about the impact of isolation on health for many people as we age. So building more LGBTQ plus affirming residences, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, around the country can help, but it's not the only solution. So we really work to educate elder housing and aging facilities on reforming their policies and their practices to create welcoming environments. And we also need to look at the laws at the local, state, and federal levels, because there are not currently laws prohibiting discrimination against LGBTQ plus people in housing explicitly. Um, and about half of queer older adults live in upstate, where they can be legally denied access to housing or public accommodations through a lack of local protection law, or, for example, in the state of Ohio, religious exemption laws, which means you can turn someone away. So with the proper laws and policies, LGBTQ plus olders we know can feel safer and welcomed in their housing. Um, but I'll talk just a little bit about some of the barriers and challenges that we see around LGBTQ plus access to housing or medical care settings. We know the connection between systemic and interpersonal violence, between healthcare access, employment discrimination, and other forms of discrimination, and feeling safe are deeply connected to housing. So some examples of this might be for people that are vulnerable, that have lost housing, or at risk of homelessness, shelter access. So we know that shelters, homeless shelters, are not safe, particularly for transgender communities. And so, who falls through the crack if the shelter system is a point of referral or a route to affordable or transitional housing? We are seeing that people are just not being included, or are not being able to access those pathways to housing for deep, if they are in deep vulnerability. So if common referral services don't feel accessible, where do folks go? Um, for example, if someone has couch surfed for years but they're not deemed chronically homeless, um, they might not be considered eligible for certain housing referrals. Um, Another thing that we see is invisibility and data collection. So there's not enough data on LGBTQ plus elders. That is slowly shifting. But there's particularly not enough data on transgender elders, because trans people are often misgendered, not captured in surveys, or distrustful of medical and service provision settings if they have experiences of trauma. And so there is definitely not enough data there. Um, and data helps fund housing, right, as we know. So there's also issues that we see that people face around family of origin rejection or loss. So a lack of familial support is something we see amongst our communities. As I mentioned, discrimination. So in in New York State, for example, gender was passed, which means you cannot discriminate based on gender identity. But that does not exist everywhere. And a lifetime of discrimination can exacerbate barriers to accessing, basic needs as people age. So it means that there is a great economic disparity. Um, and as we all know, as an inability to accumulate wealth um, means that things catch up to people as they age. Um, We see lower levels of income amongst LGBTQ plus communities due to the historic inequities of pay or blatant hiring and firing practices in the workplace. We see if there's no protection against job discrimination due to historic inequities, poverty is much harder to move out of, especially when you have no support. We see healthcare discrimination and the long-term impact of that amongst LGBTQ plus elders. So the lack of non-traumatizing medical care or medical services can lead to long-term chronic health problems that show up in housing. Um, Dementia is even impacting whole communities' kind of cognitive health decline, and there is some recent studies on that and how LGBTQ plus elders experience higher rates of dementia, just to show the impact of um, discrimination and oppression on cognitive decline. We see landlord discrimination, we see harassment, we see the unique patterns of intimate partner violence amongst LGBTQ plus elders that is not always recognized as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And so again, um, compounded isolation that makes accessing safe housing even harder. um, Aging care facilities and competencies. So nursing homes, hospice care, and other aging services are kind of getting on board to some extent, but we want folks to have policies in place, to have trainings, to have the cultural affirming and competency amongst staff that are working directly with people. Um, so I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. And I just wanted to note that we know that this is all compounded. These are not all the barriers, but some of them, and this is all compounded for elders of color, um, for Black, Indigenous, and other elders of color, particularly, um, as well as transgender elders. So when we talk about LGBTQ plus affirming housing, we're really talking about this model of affordable rental housing that provides a welcoming community of peers, community allies, and often includes some form of voluntary, culturally competent services for LGBTQ plus elders. I am going to show just a map to understand a little bit about how this model is growing. So in 2015, these were some well-known residences in operation across the country. We see Chicago, the town hall apartments people may heard of. We have Minnesota, we have Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. As of 2022, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see that this model is growing. Particularly, Sage has been a part of two new buildings, one in Brooklyn and one in the Bronx. And then the kind of one of the unique things about the Sage residences is we have our Brooklyn and Bronx Sage Center, our senior centers for LGBTQ plus elders on the first floor. And so people can come down and access programming and services there, as well as case management through our Sage services, our care management program. And people have kind of different tweaks on the model across the country. Excuse me. There is a new building in Houston that opened up that's 112 units, and that's a pretty big number for this model of housing. And that is with an organization, Montrose Center, that provides care and services for the community. And so it's really great when you see a group that is deeply embedded in the community, trusted by the community, has been working with elders for some time to expand into the housing realm and really have some key considerations around the service provision needs in mind as this type of housing is built. And these are just some other areas where various stages of development exist, whether it's in ideation and conversation or in the pre-development phase, meaning they have not opened yet, but are in some part of the planning conversation. And one that is not on here that I also should have put on here because I want to highlight that is very new is conversations happening in Baltimore. And Sage has been engaged with community stakeholders in Baltimore very early to do a community engagement process. Because one thing that is also really important in this building this model of housing is that housing can be built so the kind of like site acquisition and development piece can happen slowly, 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 then really fast, and you have to act and apply, and like there's competition, right? But what we see is that if you are not taking the intentional steps to really build trust in the community, to do community engagement, focus groups, surveys, and meet with people who are leaders in the community and who represent deeply vulnerable LGBTQ plus elders with a key focus and consideration on things like gentrification and displacement. You want to be intentional. And so when we're working right now and having conversations in Baltimore, that's something that we've been trying to center and to slow down a little bit and think about that. And I think Lavender Courtyard might in Sacramento might be just opening right now, or just opened. So it's these maps are really busy, but to show you that these are some exciting projects that have happened or that are happening. Um, and the kind of last kind of spiel that I will give is that these are some of the resources that we can help provide you or your communities or people that are interested in this model of housing. And so we have a primer that's called Understanding the Affordable Housing Development Process. And in that, we have snapshots of kind of the financing, the uh, the tenant makeup, the LIHTC funding, the kind of development piece, as well as a narrative of different models like I just showed you that are already open. So we showcase the Town Hall apartments, the John C. Anderson apartments in Philly. I think actually Lavender Courtyard that's brand new is in our most recent version of the primer. And it just gives you um, a key focus on how this process can work specific to different groups, as well as outlining the affordable housing development process from pre-development to financing to construction to groundbreaking and opening. Um, we have a toolkit that is similar to the primer, but really is online and has different modules from marketing or to intentional design to choosing your partners, and talks about some key things to think about along the way, along the journey, if people are looking to develop this type of housing. We provide connections to financing support, such as national syndicators like the National Equity Fund, we work really closely with, because often people will come to us and say, mission wise, service provision wise, we are so on board, but this is overwhelming. We have no idea how to develop housing. And that's why you build partnerships and put a team together, because none of us can be the experts in every aspect of this. Housing can feel really complicated. And that's why it's important to get in touch with a mission aligned housing developer. And we also have new housing developer trainings for housing developers, for social service providers, and community members looking to build this type of housing. And I can share that link, but these are free, self administered online trainings across a wide range of topics, from cultural competency to low income housing tax credit to marketing. And to some of the other things I discussed along the way, intentional trauma-informed design, etc. We also have national symposia and regional roundtable events. These are still virtual at this time. We might start having those in person again within the next year or so, but we're really particularly because we work with vulnerable communities, being very careful about the pandemic and about risk assessment and accessibility. So we're still holding these events virtually, but might be moving to in person again in the future. And then lastly, we provide one-on-one technical assistance to help strategize and plan, and really just have meetings with people to see where they're at and how we can help fine tune support them in any way. Um, so I kind of uh, steamed through that, bulldozed through that. But that's what I have to share for now, but I would love to hear from folks if they have questions or if they have if you have ideas or just a conversation around any of this work or around what you do in your work.
Sydney, thank you so much. And thank you so much for this PowerPoint as well. Really helpful. Thank you so much for that map. I loved seeing how this is spreading it through the country. So could you go back to that map actually?
Sure.
That would be great. We do have one question in the chat here. How can we access your toolkit resources for developing affordable housing?
I can absolutely share that
Okay.
actually in the chat, but I will also share my email in case people want to reach out directly. But the toolkit, the primer are online, and um, once I stop screen sharing because I have to remember the exact location, I'll pop that in the chat.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. And you can just send that directly to me as well. And then I can also put it in the recap of this call with the video and the PowerPoint, and then also that toolkit as well. So
Of course, yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. We have another question here. What about the new expanded long-term care equity index that includes senior housing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's been a part of SAGE's work. My colleague developed Cheryl Whalen with the National Resource Center. It's the Long-Term Care Equality Index. And specifically, so it's been a way to kind of assess and score where a group is at for culturally competent, for policy, cultural competency, for policies, for kind of an all over kind of scoring of an agency or an organization on LGBTQ plus affirming care and equity and lens, et cetera. And they have moved to do that with senior housing buildings because something that we have seen, I was actually just talking with a group with the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is that um, there's a discrepancy between people that are part of the LGBTQ plus community and people who are not around perceptions of discrimination and experiences of discrimination. Um, and so it's a way to kind of see where you're at and score where you're at and get resources around how to become more culturally competent and affirming. And that's not in my wheelhouse, but what I will do is I can share information around that long-term care equality index too, with more specifics on the process of how to engage and who to contact to get involved and to access that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Other questions from attendees today? Sydney, I have a question that came up yesterday. I was on a call with a colleague in a different state, and we talked about some things that he's seeing around recloseting for LGBTQ plus elders. Are you seeing a lot of that? Can you talk about the impacts of recloseting in older adults that you're seeing that we may need to be aware of within our communities, that some folks may be doing that?
Yeah, this is something we see a lot, unfortunately. And, there could be many reasons for this. I will say, we don't have the exact numbers because the very nature of closeting means, you
Right.
know, but we see that people, especially if they're entering a nursing home, an aging care facility, some kind of, institutional setting, et cetera, that people are definitely going back into the closet. And it might not be because they experience overt discrimination, but rooted in a fear of that because there are no indicators that they will feel safe being out who they are, right? You're also, if you're in certain situations like that, working more directly with strangers or people you don't know who are taking care of you. And that's a really intimate process, can be intimate and painful and grief filled and many things, right? And so if that is happening with a person that you've had no opportunity to build a relationship with, you have no idea what their values or views are around queer identity. So there's those parts of it. There's also the kind of overt discrimination that people have experienced in their lifetime. And also as you know, not just with aging, but with any kind of challenge with mobility or ability, if you have some level of self-sufficiency and then you become more dependent on others to do, daily activities and just manage, um, it's a different experience to rely on other people. And so we do see recloseting happening a lot. And part of the reason that providing spaces of affinity can be so important, meaning, a queer or an LGBTQ plus affirming senior center or um, even honestly going through sage care trainings to ensure people that staff have been trained in cultural competency and having rainbow or trans stickers or flags indicators on your doors, etc. You don't have to have an overt conversation with someone, but if someone sees that they're in an affinity space, they might just be a little bit more willing to engage, to open up, and not to isolate. Um, but yeah, we see recloseting happening a lot, and it really it impacts physical, mental, cognitive health decline, right? Because it's about um, not engaging, really disengaging in many ways. So it's a problem, and it's something that we hope that even if someone isn't going to be out with their neighbors or be out as fully as maybe they once were, they can feel a little safer engaging in their community without having to out themselves, but knowing that it's a safer place um, than they might have expected. And something I'll add is, when we talk about fear of discrimination or the ways that people engage with housing staff or medical staff, it's not always just kind of overt bias, right? It's sometimes people don't know when they're working with someone the assumptions that you make around who your caregiver is, who your partner is, if you have children, if you have family of origin. Like these are just assumptions that are so ingrained into kind of normative family systems um, that it doesn't necessarily mean someone's overtly biased, but it does still impact someone's willingness to be open, about who they are. And sorry, the last thing I'll add is, um, we see with youth, things are definitely not where they should be. There's a cultural backlash, and particularly around transphobia in the country right now. Um, but things also for elders in their generation were very different. And so the normalization of conversion therapy, the normalization of real threats on the daily of physical violence, these types of things still exist. Um, but how normal it was, even when we think about, raids on gay bars, right? Like the things that were a normal part of an elder's generation, generational experience impact the ways that they might be more private or not out um, today, even if it is a more affirming space.
That's great, Sydney. Thank you so much. What would you say should be kind of the first step for the staff on the call today who like to start this conversation with residents in particular? What have you seen that's worked within this conversation as we talk to residents about this, to their peers about this? And what have you seen that has not maybe not gone so well? And what would that be that first step?
I think there's different ways to engage with residents, whether it be people that are a part of the community or are not. I think a good first step that isn't, a policy can't totally change a culture, but it can start. And
Mm,
so if even if it's less personalized, that can sometimes be helpful. If there is a policy that is very clear, that is about anti-discrimination and very explicitly states anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination, that's one indicator, and it sets a precedent, an expectation of behavior. And then, that's more policy and at times could feel a little bit more legal, but even in setting community agreements, if you are working in housing, which not everyone is, or, whatever kind of space you're working in, these are behaviors that will not be tolerated, similarly and alongside like anti-racism, um, anti-transphobia, anti-homophobia. These are things that will not be tolerated because this is a safe place for, all communities. Those are kinds of a little more distanced ways to set the tone of what is expected in the agency or the housing. And then in terms of engaging directly with people, there are indicators like on intake forms. Does it include just male or female, or does it include male, female, transgender, and a wider array of gender identities on intake? People don't have to answer those questions, but even just seeing in print, yourself reflected can go a long way. And also for people who might have some bias, it demonstrates that this is a place where this is our norm. Um, and then programming, you know having programming events that are more kind of clearly about the topic of LGBTQ identity and needs, uh, having an LGBTQ pride night, right? Or, similar to other kind of cultural events that might exist around the holidays, things, at book clubs or reading circles, or, a lunch and learn about, I don't know, Marsha P. Johnson, or these are people I'm pulling out, but having events where you can both say this is kind of an affinity space for people who want to be here, but if that doesn't feel safe, also this is an educational space and we're here to learn. Because particularly for elders, I think people do want to learn and be engaged and socialized. So having those kinds of more educational and or social ways to have the conversation, voluntarily, can also be a really nice both culture shift and cultivation of affinity if someone is a part of the community.
Cindy, thank you so much for those practical steps. We've talked in housing happenings in the past, but also in a lot of the peer networking groups that I'm facilitating. A lot of our members are actively currently right now reviewing their policies, reviewing their codes of conduct, that they have for residents. They're reviewing those intake forms. And so I think it's another reminder for us to make sure that this is a part of that conversation when you are reviewing those documents and forms. And I think it's just a great practical first, if you haven't taken a first step yet, that would be your first step to do that. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I think, it always needs to be intersectional, right? So I think, when you're talking about anti-bias, anti-prejudice, anti-discrimination, it really needs to be not kind of siloed around LGBTQ plus and then people of color. It needs to be an intersectional conversation of like racism and, transphobia and homophobia and ableism. All of these forms of bias are connected, and also not acceptable. So, I think there's often a perception that LGBTQ plus people are predominantly white and middle to upper class and, cisgender, and that's just not the reality of all of our communities. I think there's a stigma and a stereotype around that, but we see deep levels of poverty. We know that, queer people are people of color, right? And I think that we need to disrupt those stereotypes, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions from those that are joining us today? I don't see any in the chat, but would love if somebody would like to unmute and ask a question. Feel free to do so.
I'm gonna just stop sharing. Pull up those toolkits real quick.
Sydney, could you speak a bit more about the importance of language in this journey of supporting all individuals?
Sure. Yeah, I think the first thing that I always remind myself is that language is always evolving and changing, and so generationally, language feels different. And also, it's not static for anyone. And so, the first and most important thing around understanding language is, educating ourselves on what language exists for LGBTQ plus people and what is the kind of wide range of language, and thinking about um, if it's in English, or if English is not your first language, like what kind of language do people use to describe themselves? Um, and the identity of queer, which is an identity that I use, is not always a safe word for LGBTQ plus elders. We have added it into the acronym because we know that, particularly for transgender individuals and for other intersectional identities, queer can feel more encompassing even for elders. But some people that are seniors do not feel comfortable with the word because it was a term used in hatred and as a form of violence, right? And so um, I think if it's relevant and we're asking someone about their identity, it's really important to just let someone self-identify and mirror the language that they use. So someone might say identify as gay, and so then that's language we would use. They might say identify as a dyke, which again is another word that many people have embraced, and some people still don't like because it was a derogatory term. And a lot of language has been reclaimed, and that can feel really powerful, even for elders. And then for some people, it just doesn't. So it's really important for us to educate ourselves on what language exists, because that language is always changing. And mirror the language, and actively listen to the language that someone uses for themselves. Um, yeah, I'll hope that's helpful.
I think that's really helpful. It's a great reminder for us as well. Any other questions? So great questions. Thank you so much for putting them in the chat. Anything else with our 15 minutes to go? All right. Well,
I'll
Sydney,
add in just the toolkit as well. I'll send these to you, Sarah, but
okay, great.
I'm just making sure the primer and the toolkit are here in the chat.
Great.
And also my email. So, I encourage anyone can reach out to me to learn more about the NHI, or if you're interested in the Sage Care trainings, which is our cultural competency certification program. And I can also share information about the long-term care equality index, particularly around senior housing.
That would be perfect. Thank you so much. And then I'll get those resources out to all of you who have joined today, and those who didn't but have registered, as well as the recording of this today, and then the PowerPoint too. So you'll get a lot of resources this afternoon, which hopefully will be helpful for you in your journey. Sydney, any final last thoughts that you have? Anything you want to leave us with?
I just want to thank you all for your important work. I am someone that's been in the nonprofit space for almost 2 decades, but working at Sage has really opened my eyes to kind of the needs of elders and the needs of queer elders in ways that are not always centered. And so I really appreciate you all for doing the work you do. and we're all learning all the time. It's never ending. So just want to, I'm grateful for you all.
Yeah, we're grateful for you too. Thank you for doing the hard work, being a friend with us here at Leading Age. Thank you so much for speaking and for the content that you brought, and just for your availability for people to be able to contact you if they have questions or further comments. But really appreciate your time with us again this morning. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day, a great rest of the week, and we'll see you again next month. Next month for Housing Happenings, we are going to be meeting on October the 12th. It is the second Wednesday of the month. So instead of the third Wednesday, as usual, we'll be meeting on the second Wednesday of the month. And we'll be talking about the difference between disorganized residents and residents who are struggling with hoarding behaviors. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. It was a conversation topic that had been brought up and raised to me. And so I'm excited to talk about that as our topic for Housing Happenings next month. Disorganization and hoarding amongst older adults. And again, the time we will meet will be October the 12th, a week earlier next month at 9 a.m. And so we'll make sure that you have the Zoom link to register and the update on your calendar, and then on our calendar for Leading Age Maryland. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day, a great week, and we'll see you again soon.